My name is Jeff Wilcox. I'm on the Windows Phone team. I came from the Silverlight team, and I'm hoping to share some tips with you today about all this crazy perf stuff. How many of you have apps in the marketplace? It's a fair number. How many of you have iPhone or Android apps in the marketplace? All right, cool. How many of you have a Windows Phone? Excellent. We'd like to see that. Okay, so how many of you have seen performance issues in Android, iPhone, or Windows Phone apps? Everybody's seen them. All right, so no surprises. Since it is the last day, real quick, if you went to Mix this year, or you saw my Mix talk, you're not in for much of a surprise today. It's going to be kind of similar. So if you did see that, I would highly recommend maybe going somewhere else. But you're here, and no one's running out the door. There's a couple other sessions at 2 o'clock later. They're all at exactly the same time. Good news is they'll be online later, but this is the remainder of the phone tracks here at Build this year. So, of course, there's all the performance basics. I'm going to kind of run through the primitives of how you go about, setting up the performance counters, telling you what those do. If you know what they are, I'm sorry, but they are helpful to learn about. I'm also going to show you kind of some of the big things we run into when looking at applications and working with customers. I actually work way too much with customers. My day job is to write code. I actually wrote the pivot control in Windows Phone, so direct your bugs to me there. Those are my mistakes. But that's my day job, and it seems like the rest of the time I'm going helping customers. There's actually people in this room right now who are very much wanting my help because they're all working on apps that are going to go ship pretty soon. But I've worked with your Netflixes and Facebooks and everyone else, and it's been a really big learning exercise trying to improve these apps over time. Hopefully at the end you'll see what the profiler looks like. That's something new we did for Mango, and at least some suggestions on what you can do for an app. But honestly, there's so many situations specific to your apps that I'm just going to give you what we've seen, the biggest hitters, and you can always email me. My email address is jwilcox@Microsoft, and I tend to read it usually. Reasons that you'd, of course, want to work on this stuff is better reviews, happy customers. This is like the marketing slogan and why you'd want to actually improve your perf. I actually have one app in the marketplace, and its performance is kind of horrible at times and really good at times. But in general, people actually think it feels really great. And so a big part of this is what can you do to make your users feel like it's faster as opposed to raw numbers. Humans tend to look at 150 milliseconds as being just enough time to notice. But if you can give them something else, kind of give them the perception of speed, they may not know that it was actually 250 milliseconds and so on. So talk a little bit about that. When it came to Mango, we did a ton of work here. So Mango is much quicker. The smooth scrolling experience is good. Hopefully you've all seen this in Mango phones. If you see people running 7.0 phones, it's actually kind of scary. We've come a long way, and I was part of the team that worked on that. I'll tell you a little bit about what we actually did for that. The big question is, what the heck actually affects graphics performance on Windows Phone? And the big answer is a compositor. What's a compositor? If you have graphics friends from college, they wrote these things. We love to rewrite compositors all the time. This is kind of the key stuff that takes kind of your visuals and your shapes and everything and splats it up on the screen. The compositor itself, it just takes these surfaces. So if you have a button, that's eventually going to become a surface. If you have a checkbox, that's a surface. An image, it's a surface. All this stuff eventually becomes a bitmap that the graphics system will then position on the screen. And the compositor does that work. It's not something as an app developer you ever touch. So you don't go ahead and compositor.call something. It's just hidden from you. But this is the magic for performance. So if you have 1,000 visuals that the compositor every single frame has to position on the screen or move, that's going to significantly impact performance more than anything else in your app. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but bitmap cache is the secret to getting something to the compositor. If you have something in a list, like a list box item, it's automatically going to happen in the compositor world. There's nothing to do. But if you're doing like game development or you have special animations, then you want to look into what bitmap cache is to actually make sure you're using it properly. Animations, if they're done by the compositor, are smooth. You can actually block the UI thread in your app, and they'll still be completely smooth on screen. That's something that the compositor does again. We'll look into that. These are the threads in Mango. So in Windows Phone 7.5, The UI thread is the big kahuna. It's the guy that was there for Silverlight. If you're a Silverlight developer, there's the UI thread and then maybe background threads, but that's really about it. In Windows Phone, we found that we needed to actually add a couple other threads to make this work better. So the UI thread is the big guy that handles OS messages, talks to the operating system, it talks to the network stack at some point, it handles all your data binding, it really does all the magical work. And so that guy is what you really can't improve too much. If you can move something off the UI thread into a background thread, that's a win. But of course, data binding, rasterizing images, all these things happen on that thread no matter what. When we looked to the Windows Phone to improving perf, so in 7.0 we had this new idea of a compositor thread, and that's the native code compositor that takes your bitmaps and then puts them on the screen. And that compositor is hopefully the best way that you can, of course, improve performance by just having primitives. If you just want to fade something in, that happens on the compositor. If you want to translate something over screen or animate in some cool little animation effects, all that happens in the compositor. And so those are the two things that were in 7.0. Of course, there's also the background thread, and the operating system's always back there in case you get a phone call or a text message. But in 7.5, we went ahead and we added in touch. So there's a touch thread, which is completely discrete from these other threads. And this actually is why you see that in Mango things are nice. They're really smooth, they're responsive. And the best way to tell it is by taking your Windows Phone and playing with lists. I didn't want to project this because actually it's horrible to see. But if you imagine any list, you can easily flick on it. It moves up or down. Now, if it's responsive, what you want to be able to do is flick and immediately touch it to stop that flick movement. And if you can't immediately stop, then you know that there's a performance problem there. Now, in 7.0, we only had the UI thread. So that's the OS, that's graphics, that's data binding. That's everything happening there. And then the compositor was taking care of the graphics. And so what that meant was in 7.0, you would flick, and we'd be doing all this crazy work. Even if you touched, we wouldn't be able to process that because the graphics system is still animating the list. And so the big win here for Mango was by having a completely separate thread that's doing touch input, it directly talks to the graphics system without talking to the UI thread. It's all graphics mumbo jumbo. Again, as an app developer, you don't worry about it at all. But the key thing to notice here is that the reason that it's better is that we actually have a native code layer which talks directly to the graphics system, the touch input, and that's just making things simple. The way to take advantage of that is use the scroll viewer or use the list box control. If you use the manipulation events or the other touch events, those things are always going to happen still on the UI thread. Now, of course, there's only so many things you can do to try to figure out what the magical numbers mean. And so inside the tools in 7.0, we put in the performance counters. And they're kind of, oh, well, this is horrible. I have a picture on the far right side of the screen that you can't see, which is called a slide fail. So here, you can see some of the numbers. And the performance counters show up by default when you have the debugger running. You'll see this on the phone when either a developer has enabled it or you're just running. And I want to kind of run through these numbers. They're pretty hard to see. Like, even if you're in front of the phone, you kind of have to get it up in your face. But the very first number is the compositor threads frame rate. And that's, again, the graphics system. In this example, it's 13 frames. 13 frames a second is pretty horrible. You can see that issue if you're a gaming guy. You'll see that it's just kind of chuggy. So 13 is not good. This would be a place you'd want to look to figure out what's going on with the visual tree. 13, again, not good. And it's red in this case. There's a couple different numbers where we'll kind of change the color to warn you. The second performance counter is the UI thread. And that's, again, the big one. So that's where all data binding happens. It's where we take buttons and other graphics and make them into primitives. So that's a key one. The UI thread can be a little bit lower in Mango. Ideally, it's 30 or 40. But if it is 15 from time to time, you won't probably see that glitch. But if you see it going down to 0 or 1, that's often because we're doing so much work with lots of layout, lots of graphics, lots of list items. The third thing doesn't matter. You can ignore it. It says over there what it is. Same goes for the fourth one, not too important, and the fifth one. Those are graphics things. Game developers are going to play with those numbers. But as an app developer, there's not much you can do unless you really need to reduce your surface count. But the magic number is this last one, and it's a double. and here it's 2.785 something. And this is the number called the fill rate. And the fill rate is actually one of the key performance indicators in terms of taking your app, whatever app it is, and making it performant. And so this number 2.7 is actually not good. It's an okay number. It's not above 3. And anything above 3 is horrible. Anything in the 2s is a little bit scary. And anything lower is good. If you're wondering what it means, a number of 1.0 means that we're drawing an entire screen of pixels. So you can imagine if you're looking at a photo, obviously we're painting the entire photo, every pixel on the screen, and your fill count is going to be 1.0. That's good. Once you get above 2.5 to 3, the GPU on the phone can actually no longer do this compositing itself, and so we have to fall back to the UI thread to do the graphics work. So in any app, you should always run with this, just a couple times a week. Pull your phone out, walk around, make sure the counters are showing, and you want to see, just in normal use, what happens to your numbers. We've seen apps where you're up to 5 or 6, and it just is horrible. You'll see performance of 4 to 10 frames a second sometimes. If you're wondering how you can improve that, a lot of it's magical, but it's mostly look for things that are hiding, things maybe behind the screen. Transparent pixels count. If we paint an entire screen of transparent pixels, it's still going to be a fill count of 1.0 because it's actually quicker to paint one than for us to try to figure out if we should or not. One little final call out on the bottom here is that we don't actually have memory counters built in the same way, but there's a way to get around that. So I'll go ahead and might as well just pull up some app goodness here. If you want to look for where the counters are, they're in app.xaml.cs. They're in the default project template, and the code is pretty basic. It typically says, if there's a debugger attached, enable the frame rate counter. And that's the screen that we just saw. There's a couple other ones here that you can use. One of them is for kind of showing what we're redrawing in every single frame. And then the other one will help you figure out some things with the GPU. Game developers, again, probably use most of these numbers, but as an app guy, just worry about the first number. And it's important to see this property. If you want to expose this to your app or maybe your testers, you could add a UI to turn this on or off. So that's where that is. Now the question is, well, what if we want to show you a little bit more than just the performance counters there? What if you want to look into memory use? I have an app that's pretty bad. It's called the Magical Leaking app. And its job is to leak memory and crash your phone. We are currently leaking. It's creating objects. They're not being destroyed. In this implementation, again, this is a good demo app, so you won't see it. But in this implementation, it's actually designed to just continuously add new objects full of crazy data and never taking it away. You'll find in apps that maybe have event handlers that remain on pages, or you're not tearing down your visuals properly. It's really hard to diagnose this, especially in a 7.0 app. I don't know what's happening. It hasn't completely crashed. Part of the reason here is I'm using the emulator and not the phone. Oh, there, that's bad. Out of memory exception. Who's seen these? All right, not as many people as I thought. This is a horrible thing. There's no way to recover from an out of memory exception. There's really not much you can do. Even if you try to catch it, your app's going to be in a bad state. And on the phone, you're looking at a couple hundred megabytes before this happens. So, of course, the marketplace has done a little bit of work here. And the testers, when they're looking at your apps, the magical number they're looking at is 90 megabytes. If you go over the 90 megabyte threshold in a small device with 256 megs, they actually won't certify your app. So this hopefully will never happen to your customers because the marketplace is sort of looking at this. But it's something to be aware of when it comes to memory. I hope you do like my awesome code. I say new byte, and that's it. But in apps, you'll find that it's not quite so easy to find leaking code. But of course, this is horrible. We got the out-of-memory exception, but nothing else. So there's a couple different things we can do. One of the things that one of our guys in the team did, his name is Peter Tor, and he actually just gave a talk. He has a thing called the Memory Diagnostics Helper. And it's just on his blog. You can blog for Peter Tor Memory, and I swear it comes up with his page. I'm just going to include this file. It's really easy. You just drop it into your project. And then in the same place where I have the performance counters, I'm just going to go ahead and add in a call to this. I think it's just memory diagnostics helper .start. The first parameter is how long you should delay before we start doing some work. If you're testing like your startup time, we probably shouldn't mess with the memory stuff during startup. So I'm going to have it delay to be every half a second. And then there's a property of force garbage collection. In 7.0, this is pretty important. But in Mango, we have a generational garbage collector, which is really awesome. It's good. But as a result, you don't need to call GC force quite as often. So I actually don't enable that property. But once you do this, we're just going to go ahead, and you'll see that there's a new magical number that shows up. And this is so hard to see. So here's those same numbers. Now you can see that the first two frame rates are 1. Oop. Yep, we just leaked completely. 1 second. It leaks so fast it's actually hard to see. All right, so right down here you can see that we're currently at 36, 38, 43, 49. This is the counter that's added that tells you the current peak memory use for the process. And once you hit 90 megabytes, there's actually a debug assertion. And so if you add this to your app, you'll find that you can just sit there using the app until it crashes effectively. It's a good way to kind of understand what's going on. But that's, of course, what we did for the 7.0 days. It still works great in Mango to have this idea of what your memory use is, but it's not everything. So something nice we have is we actually have these awesome profiling tools. It's built into every version, including the free version of the Whole Phone Tools world. And it's kind of hidden away. I've actually found people that work at Microsoft that don't know what the profiler is or where to find it. So this is a little bit of user education. You click debug, and halfway down it says start Windows Phone performance analysis. It's a nice long line item. It's important to note that it's not the same as start performance analysis. That's not the right one. I didn't work on this feature, I'm sorry. So I'm going to go ahead and start performance analysis. And you get two awesome options. You can either look at execution, which is going to be looking at the visual tree and performance, your CPU use, or you can look at memory. You can't do both at the same time, though. So I'm talking about memory at the moment. There's advanced settings that aren't really cool. You can change whatever. And there's some warnings here. The first is it's saying, Jeff, you're a little bit crazy because you're using the emulator for this. The emulator, of course, is not the same as your Windows Phone. The Windows Phone is, not exactly quad-core. It's not an i7. It doesn't have 3,000 gigabytes of RAM. So it's kind of warning you, you're not actually getting good results by using the emulator. We've actually found a lot of people that tested apps. They put them on the marketplace, especially games, without testing on a real device. Hopefully, as we all have Windows phones in the room, it's not an issue. But, of course, just be aware that if you're going to use the profiler with the emulator, it's actually not going to give you great data. And the second thing it's saying is that this is not the right configuration for your app. Right now I'm using the debug configuration. And debug's actually not permitted. In the marketplace, if you submit a debug app, they'll just fail your app right away. So you need to be... I just lost audio. You need to be in release when it comes to actually working in submitting an app. So it's best to actually also test using the release build. So I'm just going to go ahead and launch the app up. This thing leaks so fast, I actually won't leave it running too long. All right, leaking in progress. It's exciting. I'm going to hit back. At this point, the profiler will pick up, and it's going to transfer a log from the device into the profiler. And right there, we have some data. You can notice there's a trend, and it looks like memory is being used but not disappearing. This is a bad trend. The other thing you'll see is that a lot of garbage collections happened in here. That's not always a good sign either. We actually keep track of this. So this is a graph here of basically all the frames. So I can go ahead and select a segment of time and kind of look into more detail what's happening. Of course, right here we went up to about 50 megabytes of RAM. That's already almost way too much. Most apps in the marketplace are 40 megs or so. Okay. It actually gave us a warning. It's kind of hard to read, but it says there's way too many instances of system.byte. And of course, that's my leaking code. It's demo code. But in the real world, this will show you things that are being allocated way too much. But of course, this is not actually enough data to be actionable. So what I want to do is drill in. The only option for memory is your heap summary. So here you kind of get information about new allocations, allocations at the end of execution. These are things that might give you a little bit of a hint. But still, let's jump into the type table. Is it worth me zooming the screen, or is this okay? I see nods no. So at the very top, you can see that 93% of all allocated things in the process are byte arrays. Of course, that's my demo app. A real app's never going to be quite so clear of what's going on. But you might see that you have instances of people or images, data in your app that shouldn't still be hanging around. So that's kind of useful. But so much of this it's the Silverlight process itself. It's a lot of data. When it comes to analyzing your performance, there's a lot to happen. It's kind of tough, but typically look at the first couple of things. The rest, we will see everything that's internal. So here you have, actual, we have media calls. This is core runtime stuff. There's no way to worry about that, really. But, we can drill a little bit deeper. Let's pretend that it's not so clear. You can get data on what methods are allocating types and what actual instances are being created. So in the instance one, I can see for here which generation things are being allocated into, which is part of the new Mango generational GC. And that might help you figure out, is it at startup time, if it's in Gen 0, or is it maybe in the middle of app execution? And you can kind of drill into more of this data. Again, it's really verbose. There's not much else to show you right here. A key thing to note, though, is that all your performance logs are saved. So in here, there's actually a folder created called performance logs. And in here, there's the temp data. And up top, you'll actually get the full set of data that's been processed. And so you can actually send these logs between team members and perhaps actually analyze them in other computers than when you do it. So that's memory. That's one way that we've made it a little bit better in Mango. So looking beyond memory, memory is not something that's going to improve your perf. It's just going to tell you when you're leaking and when you have memory issues. So there's a lot of other things that can come into play. We actually have quite a lot of people that are creating animations in their apps, and they don't think about the fact that we always run animations. So if you have like a progress bar that is showing, it's currently doing progress of some sort, if you have it set to be visibility collapsed, which means it shouldn't be showing, we're actually still computing the whole cycle of animations that control does. And it's not because we're not the smartest developers in the world. It's because it's a really hard problem to figure out whether we should be running animations or not. Silverlight supports animations of both properties, which aren't really visual, as well as visual properties. So we'll always run a storyboard when it's running. So every single frame, we're doing a calculation for what needs to change, what's the diff, what's the new keyframe data. And that stuff's really expensive. That's going to really impact the perf in your app. And so you should be aware that if you have stuff that's off screen, we're again still doing the storyboard calculations. If you have a pivot page or a panorama page and 3 items over, you're doing animations, okay, we're doing work there too. And this is actually something that's almost impossible to figure out without just kind of either auditing your XAML or looking at the performance counters to try to understand what's happening. I have a little demo with that in a bit here. There's differences between panorama and pivot. One difference is that I didn't write panorama, but I wrote pivot. That's actually why pivot's a little bit better. Sorry, Dave. Actually, there are differences in memory use. One of the struggles we've had at Microsoft is that the panoramas look awesome. This is like the People Hub. They look cool. The Xbox tile, the whole experience with these nice animations, the nice parallax effect, man, it looks hot. And that hotness has a cost. That cost is, if you have an image in the background, you're just guaranteed right away, fill count of 1. You start adding some data into there. Okay, maybe that adds another fill count of 0.5 or so. Well, heck, it's going to look good. The people tile does it. They're going to add little images and people images. And okay, there's another 0.5. We're up to 2 on the fill count. That's just by like really basic stuff. And we found that people don't always create the most simple panorama experiences. Panorama is about simplicity. The UX guys, if you go to Brian Agnetta's talk, they often talk about panorama being the magazine cover. It's kind of the glossy cover or table of contents. There should be really basic text, maybe some images. You shouldn't have entire like news stories in there and interactive components. You should actually have that touch enabled. You touch an item, go to a new page. That's a really good way to improve a panorama experience. Just be aware of that. I have another slide about panorama and pivot here in a second. Progress bars, it's funny. I'm the progress bar king. I wish I wasn't. But last year we found out that progress bar is not perfect, and we tried to find ways to fix it. We've made a lot of improvements, and in Mango it's actually a lot better. We've actually built the operating system's progress experience into Mango that your apps can use. I'll show that if there's time near the end. The layout system, I was actually talking to someone before, someone over here, I think, and the conversation was mostly, it's this whole layout issue. Why are you calculating, images and nullifying the layout experience every single frame? This is actually a very complex thing. I used to have some really nice slides, and people said, hey, you're freaking me out. There's way too much data here. So the thing about layout is every single thing in your visual tree, we need to figure out, first of all, how much size do we have to put it in? How big should we make it? Where should we put it? These calculations are, they're non-trivial. There's a lot of work that happens. And that's kind of what makes Silverlight fun to use. It makes XAML cool. You just add a grid, you add items. Trouble is that cost is this layout experience. It's kind of this recursive thing that happens every single frame if there's a dirty part of the tree. I'm happy to talk to people about this. There have been some performance blogs about it. But beware that one of the common things you'll see is actually what's called an image jump. So if you have a list of really short items, let's say they're 40 or 50 pixels tall, and you have an image control in there that's downloading off the web, well, when we first load that list, we might have all the names. So you see like this list of 6 names. But we don't have the images yet. And most people just drop an image control right in there. So the trouble is, we show the list, and maybe a couple milliseconds later we show the first item because we have the data now for that image. And so we pop the image to be a little bit larger, whatever its size is, 50 pixels by 50, whatever the number is. And so at that point, we have to invalidate the layout on that first item, but all the other items still haven't changed. So we don't touch them. Well, in the middle of this whole thing, we update the UI, and your second image pops in. Okay, we have to nullify another section of the entire tree. And this is kind of recursive in nature when you have especially a lot of images. They just see images pop, pop, pop on the screen. There's a lot of things you can do to try to fix that. You can use cached images. The biggest thing you can do is actually just hard code your image sizes if you know them, either the height or the width if your designer has designed that. It's a really nice way to do this. Most apps, it's like profile pics, similar stuff. You know exactly how big it is. And that's a really big performance win. The biggest problem in lists tends to be first images, and second, really complicated controls. And we'll talk about that too. The last item, it's bold. You can't really tell it in this font, but the word is perception. And this is about, heck, at some point you can't really improve performance. Let's fake it. So how do you fake it? It's tough. There's a lot of options there. You'll see a lot of apps don't actually load like the second panorama item. They'll actually wait a little, maybe half a second, and then pop the second item in, because they're assuming the user doesn't immediately want to experience the second item. Just show them the first item, and then load in dynamically other items. I've seen controls, I've written a couple myself, where you go to like a new page or a new panel item, and it says, hey, it's loading. You see little dots. And at that point, what's good is that it's really easy to show text. That's one visual item. So we have text, nothing else. And then behind the scenes, you load up your entire tree. So your lists, your images, all that stuff happens below, kind of visually and hidden. And then once that stuff's loaded, you can like fade it into the screen. It looks good to the user. And it actually offloads the cost of basically startup to the page as well as rendering on those initial items. I have all sorts of hacks. I've written so many hacks, it's scary. But performance through perception is actually really important. At some point, it is just a 1 gigahertz or so device. There's only so much you can do. And I think game developers especially fully understand that there's only so much that can be done. Of course, we're Microsoft. We'd love to make it better. And we are finding issues where we can improve perf. Over each release, we have made a lot of cool bug fixes. We're sorry for the bugs. Silence. So, control performance. These are the 2 big ones. Panorama is the awesome one. When it looks at the visual experience, there's the typically fixed size items. You can have wide items. And you'll notice, of course, a panorama, when you're looking at an item, you also see a little hint of the item next to it. And that's cool. That's part of what panorama looks like. But in order to show you the hint, we have to have that second item there. Kind of sucks. So the green here means that we have loaded the item. So if you're looking at the very first item on your phone, we actually have already looked at the entire XAML tree. We've created bitmaps. We've rendered. the first item, the second item, the third item, the fourth item, the fifth item. And that's slow. So you'll see often with panorama apps, you might go to a new page or you hit back, and it might take an entire second for that to happen. And if you look in the profiler, you actually see that is pretty much all CPU time. We're rasterizing images, we're loading XAML, talking to controls. And it's really clear in panorama. Okay, makes sense. There's 5 items there, but you're only showing 1. Again, there's things that you can do to improve that, but you could also use a cool control like pivot. So pivot, the little gray squares represent XAML that we've parsed the XAML, but we have not realized visually the tree yet. And so when you go to a pivot, the first thing we show is the current item, and then we immediately load the left and the right items, but nothing else. So of course, if you just have 3 items, it doesn't make a difference if you're using Pano or pivot, they're the same. But once you get up to 4 items, with pivot, we have items that we don't look at until we get closer. So if I were to swipe over on my phone with the pivot experience to the second item, I then check, is my left item, which is now the first, was that one open? The answer is yes, it's already there. But then I look at the third item, and it hasn't loaded yet, so I'll immediately load it so it's smooth when it comes in. So this is kind of a basic form of virtualization, and you'll find that Pivot gives this to you for free. So one of the easy ways is really understand if you need to have a panorama or pivot experience. Of course, your designers, there's Ward Bell in the audience here. He's all for designers, and he typically, I'm sure, would tell people, maybe use Pivot, but heck, panorama looks really, really nice. So there is no good answer there. There's always trade-offs between your design people and the developers. You can do things like take your team out to lunch and leave the designers, go back to the office and check in fixes. That's actually a really good idea. Sometimes you can make that happen. We have team parties often, and you just try to make sure that you get the right people liquored up, and then you can do check-ins and design changes. In some business environments, this may not be appropriate. So check with your boss. So let's see if we can actually figure out what's going on in the visual tree with that profiler again. Now, one of the little caveats I should have for you is that there's only support for the profiler when you're working on a 7.1 app. You can't run it on a 7.0 app. So a lot of people might be still working on a 7.0 app, but you can just temporarily build it as a 7.1 app and kind of run through it just to see what's happening. We're using the same runtime on the Mango phone for both 7.0 apps and 7.1. In terms of performance, you get the same graphics improvements, the memory improvements, but there are differences in like XAML and some other things that we've quirked. So I have an app kind of similar to what I showed at Mix. So again, if you saw that, you're in for no new treats. Just going to run it the first time. This is the splash screen. Even on the emulator, it's taking a while. That's a couple seconds, and on the phone, this takes about 11 seconds. It's horrible. And this is really messy because I'm not a designer, I'm a developer. I don't have skills here. But you can see that there's probably a panorama on here. And of course, it's gratuitous demo issues. No one would ever publish an app like this, I hope. At least you guys wouldn't. So I can go through the items, and you can kind of see what's going on. There's a little red circle here. This is an animation that's on a different item. If you didn't look for it, that animation is costing probably 1 or 2 frames a second, depending, because there's a lot of busy things happening. So of course, I'd want to probably remove that at some point. I also have a Bing Maps control, and I haven't updated the GPS since Mix, because I'm lazy. But you can see here, Bing Maps is a really rich experience. Trouble is, it's on an item that's like 3 or 4 in. Again, my designers said, hey, we should have a Bing Maps control, and I didn't tell them no. But Bing Maps is a really complex control. It will load these image tiles in, kind of a similar deep zoom. And it's a control where it doesn't add a lot of value inside a panorama. You can actually use a Bing Maps static map. There's an API for this that just loads like an image that looks identical, but it's just a web request, and then you can show it. So there's things you can do all over the place to improve perf. Here's a useless picture. But the main thing in this app is this list. And everyone has seen in the Windows Phone, of course, blanking. You flick up on an app, and it starts to blank out items. And that's because we made a decision on the phone team that we want your frame rate to be high as possible. We'd love to give you 60 frames a second all the time. Trouble with that is some other platforms out there, which will be not named right now, they actually will cut frame rate in order to always show you these items. And so on our platform, you'll get these blanking experiences because if it's a game or it's some kind of nice, rich experience you built for being interactive, the last thing you want is for the UI to just completely halt, like in the middle of some operation in the game. So we made the choice that we'll virtualize many lists, and we won't show you the items if they're not there. We'll load them as quickly as possible, and that's where blanking comes from. What can you do to get rid of blanking? Answer is typically just simplify, make your templates a little cleaner, and I'm going to show you that. I used to do this demo showing on like the wolf vision, and it's actually really hard to see, but these lists are very slow. Inside here, it's kind of like a Netflix app. I have an image, I have a rating control, and 2 pieces of text. It seems really simple. I can't really honestly tell you why it should take 10 seconds to display. If it takes 10 seconds to display, actually, the marketplace won't even approve your app. So I have issues in this app, clearly. So if I go ahead and open up my main page, I have this really cool big demo font. I hope you don't code at that resolution. So I do have an image here, and the image is horrible because I'm not a designer. And second, it really doesn't add much to my experience at all. So I can save performance by taking my fill count and just, boom, getting rid of the image. At that point, I am going to give the option for the GPU to go quicker. Some people think that phone apps look really slick. They love the Metro style. Some people want those images there. Again, it's a design call, but one thing you can do is just get rid of images till it's faster. The other thing is, when I run this app, it just doesn't really look visually appealing because there's this big build title, but it doesn't add a lot to my experience in the app. I'm dedicating so much screen real estate to this build, when really I could be showing content and list items down there. So of course, I think a great idea would be to make this a pivot. I'm a little biased again. So I'm just going to do a little search and replace. All panoramas. Oops, all panorama with pivot. I think there's a typo. Yeah. Uh-oh. This is a Microsoft demo, folks. We have crashed. Please stand by for Visual Studio to restart. I'm actually not using the same phone tools that are on the site right now. I think this is actually a little bit older. Sorry about that. It's really embarrassing when you work on the platform and then it crashes. It's not like I can say it's someone else that did it. Yeah, I'm laughing inside. All right, I'm going to at least build this and see what happens. Oh, that's exciting. All right. This happens in almost every talk I do now. I should probably fix whatever's wrong in Visual Studio. Crickets. Oh, that looks even worse. How's your day going, Ward?
You know, I'm glad it's happening to you. It's really making my day.
Oh, boy.
Can I send you a margarita?
Okay, so we're having build issues now. Can't find the progress bar. Oh, toolkit. I worked on the toolkit. That's also embarrassing. Now we've got one person leaving. I don't recommend that, actually. All right, one more build. The conference is called Build, so I want to show you building as much as I can. All right, cool. Fingers crossed. All right, I think we're there. This is awesome. Replace panorama with pivot. Check. Okay, I think that's it. Once again, we're building. Welcome to Build. All right, so of course, it's pivot. No, there's an exception back there too. All right, pivot control. It's really hard to see, but the fill count is 1.5. It was previously 2.5. So again, this is going to be better performance just magically. Thing is, if I do, even on the emulator, kind of drag through this, you can feel that it's not exactly snappy. And that's because it's a really complicated list template. So let's actually look at the template and see what we can do to make this better. So it's pretty basic. Inside my templates, I have the image, I have the text block, second text block for the author, and then I have a rating control. And this is actually something that happens in a lot of apps. A lot of people will blog for a Silverlight component. Silverlight works great on the desktop, your 16 gigahertz computer. And Silverlight components work great in that experience. But on the phone, you have to kind of be really wary of complicated controls. So if you have user controls, which is kind of the favorite way for people to build a control, user controls actually have a little bit of a perf hit because we can't always optimize them quite right. So every time you have a user control inside a list item, we're typically parsing that XAML every single item. And so there's a little bit of a cost there. Now in Silverlight 4 and what we did in Mango, we actually do kind of save part of that node tree. So user controls are slightly faster in Mango, but if you can get rid of them, it's going to be faster. The rating control here is actually from the desktop Silverlight toolkit. And one of my coworkers wrote it. It's really complex in a good way. You can make these really beautiful stars or any kind of rating control you want. It's nicely abstracted. It's kind of one of those Microsoft over things. So if I open up the control, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's like 12 different little controls, subcontrols, subclasses that make up that rating control. And a lot of people that kind of borrow Silverlight code are finding that it's just not quite performant on a phone. And that's also because this is designed for such a specific scenario of let's do any rating control instead of let's do the specific rating control for my app. And so you can see here, every single item has the rating control and all these rating items in it. That's just for a single item. So if I go ahead and I really quick profile this app, this time I'm doing execution profiling. Go ahead and launch this. Unfortunately, the profiler can kind of take a while to analyze data, so hopefully it's quick today. All right, so our list is there. I'm just going to flick the list really quick. You can see blanking. And then I'm going to hit the back button. So at this point, the profiler goes ahead, parses that same data. Hopefully it will give us good news, or at least let us know more about what's going on. And the joke here is there's 2 progress bars on this page. Which developer designed this screen? Like seriously, as if one's not enough. I mean, I'm learning a lot from that progress bar.
Well, you're almost there.
I'm almost there. That's always what these progress bars tell you. Since I probably won't have time because of the little demo mix-up to show you, previously there was the progress bar that wasn't perfect to use in apps. There was performance progress bar, which is in the toolkit, and it's better. But what we added in Mango is a property called progress indicator, and it actually lives on every single page. And when you use progress indicator, it actually is using the same Chrome as the OS. So it's up in the very top of the screen. And so we'd really recommend progress indicator when you can use it. If you can't use it for whatever reason, okay, cool, you can use my stuff. I approve. What we have here is a graph of what's happening. It's mostly your CPU count. And you can take a section of this and kind of figure out, segmented-wise, what's happening. So from a time perspective, it took a long time to start up, first of all. It's 10 seconds, and then it started rendering. We'll also show you the frame rate for every single frame in the app. So you can see that at the very start, there was some short rendering there, but then nothing for that 10 seconds until we started rendering the list items. Of course, it's really hard to kind of jump into it, but I'm going to just kind of select the 12 to 14 second range here. And we actually do have a lot of helpful tips that might get you started, saying, hey, like the CPU usage on the UI thread is just astronomically high. Here, it's saying it's 74%. Try to figure out more, like, is it too many items, too many visuals? What exactly is going on? It's also saying here, there's a really low frame rate caused by a high layout cost. And layout cost is kind of what we talked about before, where if you have images or other items that the layout's being calculated, at some point we have to do that math, and that math does take CPU time. Of course, the more items you have, the more layout, the more that cost will be. It's observing UI stuttering. All this stuff's really helpful. You'll notice, though, it's not saying the bug is at mainpage.xaml on line 10, because that's your job as an engineer, is to actually try to figure out what's wrong. I wish we could write tools that could tell you how to do your job. But we can jump in beyond the warnings, because that's just a starting point. And so you can either kind of jump into the actual CPU use, or the better view I like is actually individual frames. So for every frame that we render, we'll actually store data about everything we can. So like at frame, let's go for 10, that frame itself took quite a while to render. It took some CPU time there. CPU use was low. And the fill rate here is 1.07. So this is the same fill rate we talked about earlier. 1's great. I'm happy about that. So I can go into frames and pick more things to jump into. And the key one here for me is actually the visual tree. If you've done Silverlight development, if you drop a button on a page, it's not just a button we're talking about. We're talking about a button, and the template expands to have a grid, content presenter. Often there's borders, text blocks, content things. A single item can easily become 100 visuals in some of the more complicated controls, like charting. And that's actually exactly what's happening here. If I jump into my app, you have your root frame, which is made up of a border. In there, there's a grid, content presenters, all this stuff. It's just wild. There's so much happening. Now, inside the page, there's my pivot control. Pivot's made up of a grid and all this other stuff. Pivot itself has maybe 20 visuals. Inside the items, eventually I'll find my main guy. So the very first pivot item then has a grid, content presenter, list box, scroll viewer, border, grid. I wish I had a better mouse up here. All right, so inside here is literally the entire list, and it's really complicated. So for a single item, this is a virtualizing list, first of all, which is usually good, but again, it's not perfect. In here you have the border, which is then made up of the basics. We do have that same text block. We have the images, and then the rating control. That looks simple. Okay, 4 visuals, we can handle that. If we have 20 items, okay, that's not too bad. Visual-wise, it's still a low number. The thing to think about is, of course, first of all, on a list, how many items are really being created? By default, the list box is a virtualizing list box, which means we show you the current screen, and then we'll also render the next 2 screens below, so that if you flick, it's pretty smooth. And so you often won't see blanking until you flick a little bit farther down the list. But that does mean that we're not looking at just 6 items. I think here we're looking at 18 items, first of all. One thing you can do if you always see blanking, but it's a short list, is you can actually turn off virtualization and just use a regular stack panel. In some apps, that's a better experience than virtualization. It's kind of, again, just another call you can consider. But I'm going to tell you, obviously it's a demo. I've already said that the rating control is really complicated. If you jump in here, the rating control is built up of just a ton of things. I did the math once. It was something like 80 or 90 items for that single one. These rating items have a grid with just all this stuff. Obviously, this is a performance problem. And the profiler didn't say it's your rating control, but just by expanding nodes and walking down, anytime you see, especially list items with more than like 20 visuals, you'd probably have a problem. Because that's just 20 items, in this case 100 items or whatever. And for every one of those, we're parsing XAML. We are talking to the layout system. We're invalidating the layout tree. We're measuring the layout. Just tons of work. And that's just from like a visual standpoint and XAML. If you think about controls, they often have eventing. They're hooking up to touch events. On Silverlight as keyboard events. They could be interacting with other things on the page. Clearly, it's just a huge cost to complicated controls. So I think one of the big takeaways here is there's no big secret really to it's really what can you remove to still make it a performant experience. So for now, I'm done enough with the profiler. I just want to show you the iterative process I took to improving this. So the first thing is I had one of the designers actually create graphics because we already know what these images look like. There's no reason to have the really complicated rating control. So in this case, there's a content control concept that will actually use a converter and some templates to return these items. When I go ahead and run this, visually it looks identical to the original one. On a phone, it's actually really quick. It goes from, I think, 10 seconds down to 5 seconds because we're no longer doing this really complicated visual tree. Instead, every single item is still the single item. There's 2 text blocks, and then here there's 5 images. And so there's probably some cost there, but each image I have a couple different star values. It works fine. One worry here is, of course, I'm showing gray items and yellow items. A lot of times people want to have the accent color for something, and so people use the opacity mask for that. If you're using opacity mask, you're probably patting yourself on the back because it looks good and it worked, but you're actually really hurting performance. Opacity mask is something that can't be done by the graphics system. It's always done on the UI thread. So I'm not demonstrating that concept of the accent color here, but it does come up a lot in image controls, and it's bad. Now, of course, why should I have so many items? I can actually, in this case, pre-render all these graphics. I'd rather add to my download like an extra 40K of images rather than making the system every single time render the 5 different images. And so the second version, that gets a little bit better, is just using a single image control. The idea being that I prepackaged all those different rating values inside my app. It's not hard to imagine that pre-rendering these kinds of things, it makes sense because the phone just, from a performance standpoint, I can do it in Photoshop or have my graphics guys do it while I'm changing the graphics specs. And it just works nice. This up here, if I'm running on a phone, I think it's at maybe 2.5 seconds. And it's just that single image, so it's pretty nice. On the emulator, you really don't see blanking very much, but if I showed you this on the phone right now, this doesn't blank. And the only simple thing was taking from this huge visual tree of something near 100 items and going down to this short number of items. So I kind of feel bad if you came here thinking that I was going to tell you the secret is, change 2 little flags and the app's fast. The big secret is simplify your visual tree, and that's really the biggest thing you can do. I'm really happy to talk to people about specifics on that. Unfortunately, we lost some time here. I'd like to take questions in a second, but I'll just really quickly kind of flip through the remaining slides to see what I forgot. One thing is startup time. Inside my app, and I've talked to others about this before, I've taken a single assembly. You often just have your Windows Phone project, but I've actually split mine out into about 10 assemblies now because we load at startup time just the assemblies you need for that first page and any referenced assemblies for it. So if you have your main page, you don't need to load like your administrator's interface or maybe some detailed screens. I moved like my about page onto some other assembly. And that's a really big perf win actually because at startup, the CLR doesn't have to read it. We don't have to validate the manifest and other stuff necessarily. It's just quicker. So I have some blog posts on this that I'll try to point people at, hopefully. I personally hate splash screens, but it's a perception thing. If you have a splash screen that pops up, people don't think as much about, well, how long is it really taking? Because they get that little visual glitch or jolt when it first pops up. And so we found that people, if you ask them to tell you how long was that splash screen up for, they'll often be like, oh yeah, I saw it. It was up there for half a second. And often it's been there for an entire second. People just, it kind of throws you off having a splash screen. That's why they exist. The thing is, if you can delete that splash screen, of course, at that point, if you can have really good startup time, really simple first page, you can make it feel more like the native app. You very rarely will see a loading or start screen when you go to the mail app. It just kind of pops right up. You can do the same thing with your apps if it's a really simple set of initial things in your assembly. And if you publish an app with the default splash screen, I will hunt you down because I don't like you. Other things, we can chat. There's some other tips and tricks for these specifics, but they're not really worth pointing out. And we actually just did that demo right there. So here's, of course, honestly, start out on the App Hub forums when you're trying to figure out issues. There's a lot of smart people, smarter than myself, that look at those things. And we get a lot more eyes on it when you use the forums. But if that doesn't help, feel free to email me. I'm Jay Wilcox at Microsoft. I'm pretty active on Twitter, sadly. And I'm happy to help you with any of your issues in your apps. So I do have about 5 minutes for questions, if you have any. Yep.
About memory, I've noticed sometimes that trigger for when you've got the memory helper running, it fires when I'm loading a web browser control, or I've got web browser control and I'm loading HTML with lots of images and stuff in it. it seems like that's took out of my control, the web browser. Do you know if that memory actually counts towards the evaluation of the marketplace? The memory that's used by the control, the web browser?
Yep. So the marketplace looks at your peak total memory for the process. I honestly don't know how it takes into account all the IE stuff. It could be a separate process. Joe from the IE team I can talk to and figure that out. I'll tweet it or something. Yep. Yes, sir?
Because you brought it up with the pivot, and it does relate to performance, there was a behavior, I'll call it, in the 7.0 version. If you tried to restore your pivot page to anything beyond number 2,
You get an exception?
You would get an exception. And is it related to this, and has it been addressed in Mango?
Yep. So the question is, when pivot comes back from like a tombstone state, if you go back to something beyond 2, you get an exception. The developer of the control made some mistakes here, I think. And I'm sure if he could do it again, he would write it differently. If you missed it earlier, I wrote the control, unfortunately. It is the same thing. Like, we visually don't have the images initially there, and then it kind of updates. We didn't fix it for Mango exactly. We did fix a lot of smaller bugs, so you may not get the exception anymore. We're trying to find a way to better service that control. And there are actually some workarounds. If you want to email me, I might be able to help you a little bit. Sorry for that guy. I'll apologize on his behalf. Yep.
Windows 8 Metro controls. Should we wait for Microsoft to come up with ones, or is it like something that open source community could do, or maybe it's for Silverlight Toolkit? So what the?
Yep. So the question is, Windows 8 Metro controls. Should we wait for Microsoft?
Yeah.
I'm actually not qualified to speak about Windows 8. I think any control you can build is awesome. Like on the Silverlight team, we did do the toolkit. We did the Windows Phone toolkit. There's also control vendors. You know, all those guys, they throw good parties, and they also write good components. I think anyone that can do it, that's great. We don't have like a public roadmap right now for the control story. So it would be good to see what people can do. And I think there's a couple different places where people are taking input, both forums and like a user voice site, saying, hey, these are the controls I want. And that's the stuff we use for planning quite often. So I'd check that out. Yes, sir.
Are you guys helping those Windows 8 guys out at all? Because like, just all the little tiny things that are really nice in the phone really suck on there.
So I'm not going to repeat the question. I will say there have been some blog posts, like many of the people that have worked on that product worked on the same team, and I've worked with those people too. So we're all talking quite a bit, and obviously we want to continue to share knowledge where we can. Yep. One last question?
One of the annoyances coming from the desktop world is the lack of editing.
Yes.
Are we going to come to combat?
Yep. So the annoyance is no edit and continue. We think it could at some point. We don't have it today. Obviously, it annoys us too. I think you saw my demo, it actually popped up saying you can't edit in real time. We have the guys that could fix it. We just need to figure out when we can do that work. And I don't have like a timeline, but hopefully, because I'd love it too. So anyway, thank you for coming. I've got a couple minutes. I'll be up here. Thanks.